Welcome, everybody. I think we'll get started. There will probably be some people coming in dripping wet. I feel like I know everybody in the room, but I will say anyway that my name is Pamela Smith. I'm in the history department. I'm a historian of science and now director of the Center for Science and Society. And I am very, very pleased to introduce my wonderful colleague, David Rosner, who is the Ronald Lauterstein Professor of Socio-Medical Sciences, Professor of History, and co-director of the Center for the History of Public Health at Columbia's Mailman School. He was elected recently to the National Academy of Sciences Institute of Medicine, and he has a long and distinguished career. He came to Columbia in 1998. He received an MPH. He has an MPH and a degree in history of science from Harvard. He has many, many fellowships and awards to his name. And the award that I liked best was the Outstanding Occupational Health, Safety, and Environmental Journalism Award given by the American Industrial Hygiene Association. But he's, of course, also a Guggenheim Fellow and has been awarded many, many other public health and distinguished awards. He is the author of 11 books. He's frighteningly prolific, can I say. His most recent books are Deceit and Denial, The Deadly Politics of Industrial Pollution, and most recently, Lead Wars, The Politics of Science and the Fate of Americans' Children, from which he's going to talk today. So please help me welcome David Rosner.
Thanks very much. This is a little intimidating, having to stand up here and talk to my family, okay? And I think I know 50% of you in the room. Thank you for coming out. That's very kind of you. I appreciate it. I'm going to talk to you today about my experiences as a historian entering into some contentious debates over disease and health and what we as a society consider the responsibility of scientists and physicians. I'm going to be talking about my experience in courtrooms and what happens when a historian enters the courtroom. I think that all of us know that virtually every day we're confronted by headlines about science and about medicine, and this is, in some sense, a new experience for me in the sense that I expected to spend most of my life as a scholar in dusty books, working alone without anybody around me, and suddenly I'm thrown into a whole bunch of court cases. I'm going to be talking specifically about this kind of new phenomenon of historians being dragged into court cases. And I want to just start out by pointing out an email that I received a number of years ago as I was preparing for a court case that I was very deeply involved in, just to give you a sense of how important historians are becoming in a series of whole set of disputes over environmental and occupational disease, over science and what it represents in American culture. This is an email from Bob Novarini, who represents the RTG consulting group, and she's looking for an academic historian. She wrote me, "Dear Professor Rosner, I'm writing to introduce you to Roundtable Group and to notify you of the specific short-term consulting opportunity which may be of interest. Our attorney client is seeking an historian, highly credentialed and at a prestigious university, to perform some historical research and instruct a lay jury on what was known about a particular occupational hazard, lead paint, between 1950 and 1980. This was interesting to me. The historian need not be a subject matter expert, which I interpreted as meaning you don't have to know anything about what you're talking about, okay? Our client is mainly interested to find an historian who's a good communicator, someone who can easily communicate a story to a lay jury. I found this fascinating. In some sense, it was totally, for me, an obscene moment in which I was being requested by industry to talk on their behalf in courtrooms to a jury. And my only qualification had to be, one, that I was from a prestigious university, I was highly credentialed, and I was a good communicator. I found that very interesting. I'm going to skip through this. I'll explain the significance of this in a while. And then ask me whether I wanted to do it. It said we could interview you. I tried to find out the names of other historians who are doing this. But it was very interesting to me because at that very time that they were asking me to testify on behalf of industries in a lead case, I was preparing to go into a major lead suit on behalf of the state of Rhode Island. I've been preparing for this for a number of years, and I was about to enter into a lawsuit in which the state of Rhode Island was requesting and demanding of the lead industry a huge sum of money to basically detoxify their state of what is essentially the largest industrial and longest lasting industrial poison and childhood epidemic in American history, lead poisoning. And I'll explain a little bit about this case because it was very unique. But as I was preparing to enter into this case, the industry was trying to recruit me to testify, I guess against myself. I found it kind of interesting. We'll talk about that. Essentially, I'm going to talk about the history of occupational environmental disease over the course of the last 40 years through the lens of 3 books that I wrote, okay, that Gerald Markowitz and I wrote. The first one is Deadly Dust, which is a book about the history of a disease that probably only a few of you have ever heard of, called silicosis. It's a disease that affects and historically has been seen as affecting upwards of 500,000 American workers during the Depression. It was considered epidemic and a major crisis, and as we'll see, engendered a great deal of attention. I wrote this book, and I'll discuss this in a little bit, and was surprised when I found out that the disease was no longer there. Okay. No, it was actually still a major crisis. The second book that I'll be talking about is this book called Deceit Denial, which I wrote with Gerald Markowitz in 2002, which is a history of environmental damage caused by lead and also caused by plastics. This is another book that would end up in court cases very shortly. And the third book, which I just recently published, Lead Wars, is a book that tries to detail how the evolving understanding of what disease is and the evolving contention between different parties over what disease represents, occupational environmental disease represent, regarding who is responsible, what causes disease, who we should hold accountable, how we should deal with it. This book is looking at the contention and the crisis over disease as occupational environmental disease as it's currently affecting the public health community. We'll talk about all this as we go through these 3 books and go through the story behind them. I'm going to first talk about Deadly Dust, which was published in 1991, and which was a short book that I expected that would gain very, very little attention. It was published by Princeton University Press, and the short story is that the book was done as an academic monograph, but very quickly ended up in a series of lawsuits. I'll tell you a little bit about the history behind this book, just so you can get a sense of how I got involved in this whole issue. In the 1980s, I was asked to write a short paper which had emanated from one line in my first book, in which I said that the reason people went into hospitals in the 19th century had less to do with infectious disease than it had to do with the development of the urban city. The development of the city, accidents, industrial accidents were a main cause for introduction into hospitals. It was an observation that I considered interesting at the time, but which led into a question about what is the relationship between disease and the development of urban environments, and how did that, in some sense, lead to the development of hospitals and other kinds of health institutions over time. At the time, I had begun doing a history of occupational disease with jury. And we'd been traveling down to Washington, D.C., and we met a man who was responsible for the definitions, or for the discovery and the political efforts to create what was called black lung legislation. He was a worker, he was a physician who worked with the United Mine Workers, and he had been very important in getting legislation about black lung, which at that time was a very, very important occupational disease. It was considered, it still is, a major cause of disability among the workforce in Virginia. And we went down to his home and began interviewing him in between our stints at the National Archives as we were going through materials. He was very old, he was on a respirator, and basically every time we went down there, we'd stop by his house for lunch, or we'd bring over lunch. At that time, as we asked him questions about black lung, he began telling us that in order to understand the history of black lung disease, we had to understand the whole history of this disease called silicosis, which we had literally never heard of. And through a series of discussions, we began to realize that this disease, silicosis, was extremely important in the history of the discovery of lung disease. Basically, we discovered it because we were, our filing system in our office kind of determined what we looked at, and we realized that the piles of articles about silicosis from the 1930s got much higher than any other pile we had in the room. So we wrote this short little book called Deadly Dust that we thought would attract a very small audience of academics, possibly in the history of medicine. And it was published in 1991, and very shortly after it was published, we got a phone call from Princeton University Press that said they were putting out a paperback. For those of you in academics know, that means essentially they sold out the hardcover, and that's a kind of compliment. And I said, who bought it? And they said, well, it must be medical historians. I said, no, medical historians at that point were just doing histories of the rubber glove, histories of scientific technique, histories of doctors and their thoughts and their books. It wasn't them, I knew that. Then they said, well, maybe it was labor historians, because this has a lot to do about the creation of disease in the workforce. And I said, no, labor historians at that point were probably more involved in talking about men drinking in bars, I don't know, about the culture of work and union struggles. So I said it wasn't them. Who did it? And they looked at their list, and they came back and said, it's very odd. The book is going out to buy what they called box load, huge amounts, 10 books at a time, to places like Butte, Montana, Odessa, Texas, the Gulf Coast of Mississippi, all sorts of strange places around the country. And what they looked at, and they noticed that it was going out to law firms throughout the country. Why? Because it seems that our book had fallen into a whole set of legal disputes among workers who had been dying from silicosis throughout the country in very, very remote places, and that there was actually an epidemic of silicosis going on in the early 90s. It seemed that during the 70s, during the oil boom, and during the Vietnam War, large numbers of workers had engaged in sandblasting and other kinds of activities in preparation for the storage of oil following the OPEC oil crisis and during the Vietnam War. And that large numbers of immigrants had been brought up from Mexico. Mexican workers have been brought up and literally sent into the oil fields in Texas, in places like Odessa, where they were given paper masks and sent into oil tanks where they would take air-fed power hoses and begin sandblasting the inside of tanks in preparation for the storage of oil that was now profitable in Texas. And that these workers had begun dying. And this is just one of the articles that came out of this as an example. Very shortly after our book was published, I learned about this epidemic because I was called by law firms. This law firm is specifically in Odessa, Texas, which, is anybody from Texas here? Nobody? Okay, I can say this. It's the end of the earth. Okay, this place is really in the middle of very, very rural areas, far from anything. It's dominated by the oil companies, and Odessa, I was called by a law firm in Odessa asking if I would come and testify in a law case the first time. And I was kind of stunned and a little bit embarrassed. It seems that the book had fallen into a contentious legal debate in which industries that had been held accountable in courts for the occurrence of silicosis among the workforce had been claiming that they had not been responsible or any more responsible than anyone else because, after all, nobody had ever heard of this disease. Suddenly our book appeared, and it was clear that there was a long history of knowledge about the dangers of asbestos, of silicosis, and that this disease was affecting people despite this long history of knowledge within industry and within the scientific literature that we documented in this book. The book had simply asked the question about this epidemic of silicosis in the 1930s, in which literally hundreds of thousands of people were estimated to be at risk of silicosis, and yet among epidemiologists, yet by the 1940s, the disease virtually vanished from the scientific literature. How is it that a chronic illness caused by the inhalation of dust, sand that's pulverized against hard objects, and that gets into the lungs of workers, can in 1 decade, and that takes 30 years to occur, can in 1 decade be seen by the scientific community and by the medical community as affecting upwards of 500,000 people, yet vanish from the literature by the 1940s. Just didn't make any sense, and that's what the question that we addressed in this article was, in this book was. It was a small little case study of a disease that came and went and vanished, and yet it was still occurring throughout the country at this point in time. When I was down at this first court case, what became apparent is that not only was the disease really prevalent, but that there had been an insidious social world in which this disease occurred that essentially put large numbers of people at risk and had literally hid this disease. Most of the workers who were going to trial were Mexican immigrants, undocumented workers, many of whom were dead, who had died from exposure to silica dust, had been hired by Citgo and other oil companies through contract labor agreements, and who had been brought up to the fields, exposed to huge amounts of silica, and then shipped back to Mexico, often where they died. That's what this article is about, these 2 fatal articles by these 2. The epidemic was uncovered by this physician, Steve Weisenfeld, who was a doctor in the area, who began treating Mexican workers and Mexican immigrants, and found that, and had originally thought that they were dying of a disease of tuberculosis. But upon closer inspection and working with his friend Jerry Abraham, ended up discovering that when pathologies were done of the lungs, these workers had been exposed to huge amounts of silica, and the disease that they were suffering from, the wasting away, the spitting of blood, the coughing, the inability to breathe deep breaths, the fevers, all of which are symbols of tuberculosis, are symptoms of tuberculosis, are also symptoms of silicosis, and that these were actually people dying from occupational rather than environmental disease. This had enormous implications, this observation, because what it meant was somebody had to be held accountable for why these people were dying. This is just a report. I was kind of very proud because our book played an important role in discovery of this disease. I went and testified, and during the trial, I ended up meeting the parents of the dying worker, and also the wife and the daughter. And during that time, I came to a realization that what I was involved in was something much more than just being a historian in the courtroom, but that in some sense I was becoming a witness to a whole social transformation and a whole social drama that went way beyond the history of disease, particularly, specifically disease of silicosis. When I was waiting in the waiting room getting ready to go on stand, this woman came up to me with her daughter. She spoke no English, and her daughter began thanking me for having come down there. And I said, to testify on behalf of her husband. And at that time I'd realized, I'd been on the stand for a day, and I realized that there's very little likelihood that she was going to win this case. The jury looked very, very suspicious of the case, very suspicious of me, very suspicious of this Mexican worker who was asking for compensation. It was a very Anglo jury in a very conservative part of the country, and you could just tell by their body language that they were not interested in hearing from me, who I had been identified as, quite literally, almost in these words, as a New York Jew, by the defense attorney. It was very interesting. But that this was, high stakes poker, and that these were not a friendly environment for a Hispanic worker. So I kindly said, listen, you have to tell your mother that I appreciate her, thanks, but she shouldn't hold out much hope that she's going to get any compensation. And at that point, she looked at me and she translated what her mother said to me, which was that this had very little to do with the money. She was very grateful that a New York professor would come down to Odessa, Texas, to testify for her husband. In any case, it was a very moving moment for me, because it brought home that these dramas that are going on in court cases have less to do with our cynical view of money than often they do about a public debate about responsibility, who should be held accountable, and how the lives of working people should be valued. This is what happened very shortly after I appeared in that case. Articles began appearing, basically attacking this lone historian, which was kind of interesting to me, because why would history be that important in these cases? This was one called On Deadly Dust. My book was Deadly Dust, and the Histrionic Historians, which was published in Mealy's some legal journal by a lawyer. The work of Professors Rosner and Markowitz raised important questions about the role of historians in play in the litigation process. In writing about the social, labor, and political history of silicosis, Rosner and Markowitz interpret and draw inferences from evidentiary displays of credibility, motives, and goals of industry. They were very upset that I was involved in these lawsuits. We could safely leave the fate of Rosner's and Markowitz's historical scholarship to their community of academicians and historians, if not for one discomforting fact. Either directly through their participation in court cases as expert witnesses, or indirectly through opinions offered and sneaked into evidence, the views of Rosner and Markowitz have become part of the passion play that we call silicosis litigation. I found this absolutely fascinating. Here was our testimony being seen through the lens of the legal world as essentially an attempt to capture a narrative about what caused disease, and capture a narrative that has historically been controlled through industry, which I found really interesting. Let me go back and give you a little history of silicosis, okay? I know this is a cartoon from the 1930s from an African-American newspaper about what silicosis represented following a major crisis in which over 700 workers, African-American workers, died in a town called Golly Bridge, West Virginia, because of exposure to dust that the Union Carbide Company had allowed them to be exposed to while building a water tunnel, to power their chemical plants in Charleston. This became, as I mentioned before, a major crisis. These are some of the headlines. Silicosis problem in state of crisis, hazard held on the way out. 500,000 exposed to silicosis daily, symposium at Harvard, here's prevention's the only remedy. This is a movie that I'm going to show you a little bit of, and I hope you don't mind sitting through this. This is a silent movie from 1914, which I think in many ways captures the problem that I, as a historian of science and medicine, began to recognize as my experience in the courtroom brought new issues to attention. This is an Edison film. Has anybody seen this? You have, okay. This is an Edison film, which is about a worker who's working in a pottery, and he comes out of the pottery being exposed to huge amounts of dust, and he's dying. And he's fired by the owner. You see the owner over here who's firing him. The doctor, of course, is telling him, you can't fire him. You have a responsibility to this man. He's your employee, but he's fired. The worker goes home, and very quickly, what you see in this film is contention about what causes illness. And in the film was depicted at least two very, very different visions of this illness. On the one hand, you have the worker's view that his disease was brought about because of his conditions of work and because of the dust that he was exposed to, and hence he was owed something by the factory owner. On the other hand, the factory owner argues that his disease is not really industrial in origins, but it actually is environmental. It's not what we would call silicosis. It's not because of the dust, and it's not because of work. The disease is something called tuberculosis. And here you see an example. This is a great document. Tuberculosis, the doctor is coming in and telling the family that he has to take the child off the floor. You can't sweep. You have to do certain things to protect the family from the bacillus, tuberculosis bacillus. The doctor notices that the child is sick, right? And they're sick basically because of the activities of the family working in this environment. He's opened the window. I don't know if we've already seen. He's already opened the window saying, let fresh air in. And he's telling the man, please don't let your son drink out of the cup. Don't let your child stay on the floor. Keep the window open, and somehow you can control this disease. Of course, watch what happens right now. The child's put down, the windows are closed, and he begins to cough, and he begins to get sicker and sicker. Again, the contention of whether this is an environmental illness or whether this is caused by industry is extremely, extremely critical. The baby's dying now, 2 weeks later. The baby is dying, or actually dead, right? And the family is distraught. And you'll watch the doctor as he leaves the house. This is a period when bacteriological theory, bacteriological explanations of disease are being introduced into the medical literature and are in some sense in contention with an older notion of disease that sees disease very closely linked with the place, the personal circumstances of individual workers. You can go into the whole history of this. He's very upset, but then he says, I have to go reform it. Right? The child's distraught, the man is distraught, and he sees vengeance in his eyes. So interpretation of disease, I got the rot in the Pratt pottery, and my curse is on Harrison Pratt. What this represents is real contention over the meaning of disease and what it represents in American society at a moment of mass industrialization, okay? Huge numbers of workers are coming into factories, being exposed to power tools, being exposed to all sorts of new kinds of toxins, and there's contention over how we're going to define it. I'm going to skip over a lot of this, but let me just tell you the end of the story, okay? Simply put, the children of the factory owner come down with tuberculosis, and they come down with it because the owner of the factory, Pratt, has hired the daughter of this factory worker, and this daughter had gotten tuberculosis from her father, and brings it to the Pratt family, and communicates it to the children, and the children now die. Okay? The point being that during the progressive era, at least, the way we explained disease was almost in moral terms. And what bacteriology meant was that we could find a way of remedying the inequalities in the society through this kind of moral equation. The daughter dies, her lungs are affected, he's terrified and upset, and ultimately the worker says he's gotten his vengeance. I fear it is tuberculosis, but with fresh air and proper attention, she could probably be cured at home. It's a very ritual film. I'm going to go on from this. I just want to play this song to talk about the way that disease and danger is interpreted within the labor movement in the 1930s. You can sing. Anybody want to sing? Come on, we can try it. But it affects popular literature and popular thought throughout the 1920s and 1930s. Watch the rocks are falling. Come on, you can sing this. You know this song. No? Nobody wants to sing, huh? It's a small enough group. Keep your hand upon the dollar and your eye upon the scale. Union miners stand together, keep the operator's tail. Come on, folks, you know this song. Hand upon the dollar and your eye upon the scale. The point of this simply being that this issue of disease and danger is seen within the context of the labor movement as a highly politicized and important issue. Who are we going to explain? How are we going to explain disease and danger? It's part of a struggle that's going on among workers and management, labor and government that's going to affect it. It's not seen as a biological issue, it's seen as a political and social issue. I'm going to play you another song, a couple of songs, I know you're going to hate this. This is, in the 1930s, disease itself becomes part of a popular way of understanding responsibility. I'm going to go on to another song, which, if you have class and social position beginning to be introduced into the equation of what goes into the definitions of disease and responsibility, you also see race becoming an important issue. I'm going to play this. Actually, let me play this one first, okay? This is another song some of you may know. Does anybody know this song? This is Merle Travis, who writes a song in 1946 called Dark as a Dungeon, in which he very clearly identifies
a coal miner's job is one of the toughest there is. It's like an old fella told me one time, once a miner, always a miner. If you work in the mines, the coal soot gets in your blood. That's according to me and according to this song. Come and listen, you fellas, so young and so fine, and seek not your fortune in the dark, dreary mines, where the demons of death often come by surprise.
But again, the issue of disease and danger becoming embedded in kind of a politics of labor,
where it's dark as
which really has potency
and damp as the dew, where the danger is double.
It's kind of a dangerous
and pleasures are few, where the rain never falls and the sun never shines. It's dark as a dungeon way down in the mine.
Goes on verses about danger and
it's a many a man I have
known
in my day who lived just to labor
your
his whole life away like a fiend with with his dope.
The point of all this
and
being
a drunkard is
who controls the
wine.
narrative,
A
which
man
is
will have
what that lawyer attacked
for
me
the
for,
lure of the
was
mind.
extremely
Where
important.
it's
Who
dark
controls
as
what
a
the
dungeon
definition of this
and
disease
damp
is, what
as
causes
the
it,
dew,
who is
where the danger
responsible,
is double,
whether it's an
and
environmental
pleasure's
illness,
a
whether it's a
few, where
professional
the rain
problem,
never
or whether it's a
falls,
class-based
and the sun
issue,
never shines.
have enormous implications.
It's dark as a dirt.
Here's this one I love. This is from 1936. It's by Josh White.
How silicosis made a mighty bad break of me.
I can't believe you're not going to sing. Aww.
You robbed me of my youth and health. All you brought for me was
grief.
now silicosis. You a dirty robber and a thief. How silicosis, dirty robber and a thief. Robbed you of my right to live, and all you brought for me.
Listen, I can't get you singing. I once had 200 occupational hygienists
I was
singing.
there digging that tunnel for 6
You academics. I'm really shocked. If I can get occupational hygienists singing, I should be. What's that? Yeah, no, this was at a meeting of industrial hygienists and occupational physicians. They were singing away.
I says, mama, 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 cool my fever head. I says, mama, mama, come and cool my fever head. I'm gonna meet my Jesus. God knows I'll soon be dead. 6 bits I got for digging that tunnel hole.
You get the idea.
6 bits
This
I
is
got for
real contention of the meaning of disease
digging that tunnel.
during the 1930s.
Take me away from my baby. It sure done wreck my soul.
This again is some headlines, just a couple of headlines showing the extremely importance of silicosis. It forces this popular understanding of the disease as a labor issue, really forces this onto a national agenda, both of government as well as medicine itself. Without this kind of popular uproar, we probably wouldn't see the attention that silicosis brought during the Depression. This is Frances Perkins, who, the first Secretary of Labor, first female Secretary of Labor, first cabinet member, going down, descending into a mine in Missouri because of the silicosis crisis. So she organizes a conference about silicosis in the tri-state area of Missouri. I love this picture. This is a film she made, the first film made by the Department of Labor about industrial disease. What? You notice, Division of Labor Standards was organized under Perkins as an antidote to the U.S. Public Health Service, which was ignoring occupational disease as a significant issue.
1935,
I'll explain that in
a
a
wave
second.
of fear was sweeping the country. Silicosis was taking its toll from the ranks of American workers. Cause of the disease, dust. Results of the disease, disablement, poverty, death. Cure for the disease, none. Throughout America, workers exposed to dust grew fearful of their health, of their very lives. 1936. Amid these alarming events, the Secretary of Labor called together a national conference to study this disease. A committee of 60
This is
experts
the
was
second
appointed,
national
and a year later
conference in
reported to the
Department of
Secretary of
Labor's
Labor.
history.
But let's hear
The
from Ms.
first one was
Perkins
about
herself.
lead.
After a year of work, the National Silicosis Conference Committee has just made its report of findings and recommendations.
I just love
and
seeing
I
her.
feel it to be my duty to make this report available to the working people of the United States and to their employers by every available method. This report shows how silicosis occurs, where it occurs, and what the disease is, and it makes recommendations for its practical control.
I'm going to show you a little bit of, just a little bit later on in the film.
Finely pulverized granite is put into bags to be used as asphalt filler or other uses. This machine is being operated in such a way that the workman must breathe in clouds of harmful dust, and this man is totally unprotected.
The silica dust being put in bags. Silica was very useful in all sorts of industrial processes.
The foundry shakeout, wherein castings are removed from the molds, is also a dusty operation.
If you remember the
These two men are working
earlier
without any
film,
protection whatsoever.
Temple
They
of
are
Moloch.
potential silicosis victims.
Watch this same imagery, the same story being told essentially in this 1937 film.
Here is a typical American workman, one of the million who are dangerously exposed to silica dust. His name is John Steele. Once a master molder, he is still working in this foundry after years of exposure to silica. Once strong and healthy, John Steele is now weak and emaciated. He is short of breath. He cannot do even this work properly. The foreman tells him that he is sick, incompetent, can no longer do a day's work, and that he must let him go.
It's the same story as basically the Temple of Moloch 30 years before, but now with the imprimatur of the U.S. government on it, which is very interesting.
He hands John his last time slip. As a result of his disability, John, like thousands of others, is being fired.
And disease is being seen as, in
He
some
is paid
sense,
off.
a product
Broken
of
in health
depression.
and in spirit, out of a job, he must seek work elsewhere. John Steele was more fortunate than many another silicosis victim. He was able to find work in a tombstone shed, work which was not too heavy, and where he could earn a little money to help support his family. But he is still exposed to the enemy. Across John Steele's mind flashes his fate. How soon will it become a stark reality? How soon will he join the thousands of others who have succumbed to silica dust?
It's interesting to me, when you look at this film, that it's the Department of Labor who's making it, okay? Not the U.S. Public Health Service, as I mentioned before. In some sense, it's being defined as a labor issue rather than as a health issue, and rather than a public health issue. It's a somewhat different story, but it talks to the way that medicine and public health at this period of time is being professionalized and being seen as, quote, a scientific issue rather than a political or social issue. During this period of time, as I mentioned, the Division of Labor Standards is established within the Department of Labor mainly because the Public Health Service is doing so little about working conditions. And that's an interesting kind of fact of the 1930s. The Department, U.S. Public Health Service, you can remember some of the, milestones of its history at that point in time. This is when they're beginning the Tuskegee syphilis studies, things that will later come back to haunt it. But essentially is turning to a definition of itself as a science, as a laboratory-based and data-driven field rather than a political field and a social field and a labor field, so to speak. This is just another song, and I'm going to stop here with this little litany of music, but this is from very recently. And what I want to point out to you, this is a song by Sweet Honey of the Rock, and it's about asbestosis, silicosis, brown lung, black lung, but it's also added in a whole new dimension of industrial and environmental disease, mainly radiation. So this kind of...
Ones and families, we bring more than than a paycheck. To our loved ones and families, we bring more than a paycheck. To our loved ones and families, more than a paycheck. To our loved ones and families, we bring more than a paycheck. To our loved ones and families, we bring more than a paycheck. To our loved ones and families, I wanted more.
I wanted more pay.
What I've got here today is more than I bargained for. Loved ones and families, we bring more than a paycheck. To our loved ones and families, we bring more than a paycheck. To our loved ones and families, more than a paycheck. To our loved ones and families, we bring more than a paycheck. To our loved ones and families, we bring more than a paycheck. To our loved ones and families, I wanted more. But what I've got here today is more than I bargained for. When I walk through that door, I bring home asbestosis and silicosis, round, long, black, lung disease, and radiation hits the children before they've really been conceived. We bring more than a paycheck.
This kind of, for me, a very haunting picture, because it's a picture of a man drilling into the wall of my office from the outside. And when you've read this history and you know what he's being exposed to, you wonder how Columbia could do this. But he's obviously going to be dangerous. This is just a picture from the graveyard in Barry, Vermont, where silicosis workers, or where granite cutters, skilled granite cutters, artisans, had been recruited from Italy to work in the granite sheds to carve various kinds of monuments. Many of them carved their own tombstones, some of them very, very beautiful and very intricate. This is one from the tombstone of a worker who was dying of silicosis after he began using, instead of the hand tools that he once used, now the new, what they called widow makers, the drills, the high-powered drills driven by steam and air power and steam power. He carved his own gravestone. This is kind of the pietà of his wife holding him. He actually wrote a history talking about how he wanted to be buried. We're going to get very quickly through Deceit and Denial, because that book really talked about the contention over occupational disease and the lawsuits that we were brought into. This book really was a further expansion of that theme, looking at the ways that industry reacted when they found bad news about their products. And the book basically looked at one classic disease called lead poisoning, childhood lead poisoning, disease that's is probably the longest running epidemic in American history. Childhood epidemic, it's gone, first cases were in 1914, a century ago, identified at Johns Hopkins. Today, the CDC estimates that there are upwards of 500,000 children still affected by lead, no longer going into convulsions, no longer dying of acute symptoms, but now their neurological, behavioral, and emotional problems related to exposure to low-level lead that continues to plague American children because of the lead on the walls of the nation. Okay, so it's a continuing epidemic, and the second part of the book, that was used as a means of identifying an old occupational hazard that has transformed itself from being an occupational hazard within a factory, identified first among workers, to an environmental toxin on the walls of the nation. The second part of the book was about this material called vinyl chloride, polyvinyl chloride, which was identified in the 1970s as causing a disease called angiosarcoma of the liver, liver cancer among workers in a number of plants who were manufacturing PVC. And the story basically is what happened when the industry discovered that these workers were dying. Almost immediately upon publishing this book, this is what happened to us, okay? 20 of the biggest chemical companies in the United States have launched a campaign to discredit two historians who have studied the industry's efforts to conceal links between their product and cancer. In an unprecedented move, attorneys, you can imagine what this was like. This is attorneys for Dow, Monsanto, Goodrich, Goodyear, Union Carbide, and others have subpoenaed and deposed 5 academics who recommended the University of California publish the book. Our reviewers were subpoenaed. Some of them met in the middle of the night with subpoenas and forced to give depositions, not very serious ones. But this was a kind of another example of what happens when the narrative, when history can come in and change the narrative that has been constructed to explain disease, and the stakes that are involved. I mean, this is not, I don't know how you would react, but when we saw the names on the subpoenas and on the subpoenas to us from Dow, Monsanto, Goodrich, and Goodyear, it was pretty intimidating. I must say, Columbia actually was pretty good about that. They refused to let them get their records. They wanted our files. They wanted our emails. They wanted our correspondence. They wanted all sorts of things. And Columbia actually tried to quash it. So I was kind of grateful to our counsel here. These are some other articles. Yes?
Was it California Press?
University of California Press.
Did they come forward with contextuals or?
No. They actually provide the names of the peer reviewers. I mean, they did it because under court order and under all sorts of IRB and consent decrees, you have to follow what a court orders. I mean, you just have to. And so they turned over the records. There's nothing especially crazy about those records, and they didn't see any reason not to. But the industry was trying to find ways of kind of intimidating us, intimidating the press. They also subpoenaed the records of the Milbank Fund, which had supported our book. They tried subpoenaing the records of the NSF, but all the NSF records are open anyway, so they didn't have to issue a subpoena. So it was kind of ongoing drama in which basically it was an attempt to just harass us. That's that. This is the kind of evidence they were really concerned about, that we were showing how popular understanding, how the industry actually promoted the use of deadly toxins to children at a time when they understood from their internal records that lead and vinyl were dangerous products. And that's what gave them. This is just a book that was given to children on telling them about the benefits of lead paint. This is what happened during a lawsuit. There was a huge, the context of this is simply that the state of Rhode Island, after seeing the documents and the historical records, after reading the book essentially, decided to sue the lead industry, not only for past damages to the state and to the children, not only for the children who were damaged, but in a very innovative lawsuit, decided to sue the industry to stop future damage. I was on the stand for 6.5 days. My co-author, Jerry Markowitz, was on the stand for 6.5 days. And the jury came back after, this was a very unusual suit. In other words, it was saying, we are asking for money to remove lead from the walls of Rhode Island because we know that in future years children will ingest this and they will be damaged. And therefore an industry that knowingly put lead on the walls or sold lead and profited from it without informing us of its dangers should be held accountable for removing the danger before that danger occurs. It was a very innovative suit. It was the longest suit in Rhode Island history. It ended up in a jury deciding that up to $4 billion should be given to the state of Rhode Island to detoxify the cities of Providence and a number of other communities. It was a pretty big victory. I sometimes said that it was the happiest day of my life, the proudest day of my life, until my wife told me that I'd better not say that anymore because I had other happy days. had children and, you know, marriage and things like that. So in any case, 2 years later was probably the most depressing day of my professional life because the Supreme Court overturned that ruling based on the fact that no children had yet been damaged, and therefore they had no, quote, standing in court. I don't know, are any lawyers in the room? Okay. And they had no standing, so until people were damaged, you couldn't sue for remedy. So that was thrown out after 2 years of legal hassles. What's interesting, and I'll stop after this, is that just this summer, a year ago this summer, the state of California, mainly the cities of Los Angeles, San Diego, Berkeley, San Francisco, Oakland, and a couple of the big cities, sued on the same basis that Rhode Island sued. We also went out there. I was out there for 2 weeks, and the judge heard the data, heard the historical data, and decided that the industry should pay $1,150,000,000 to these cities to detoxify the walls for at-risk children. Slightly less expansive than the Rhode Island decision. What's interesting about that, and we're now waiting for the decision, the appeals to go through, is that the state had already gone to the Supreme Court to get a judgment as to whether or not what they called nuisance law, the prospective attempt to stop future damage, could be used as a means of protecting the state and getting damages. And while the Rhode Island Supreme Court said they couldn't, the California Supreme Court said, of course you can, because all public health law is preventative. Their principle was all public health law is meant to prevent disease, not to remedy it after it's happened. And therefore, of course, you can sue if someone is causing potential harm. You could try to find remedy for it. So we're much more hopeful in the California case. But there are other suits that are beginning, and people are watching the California case because of this Supreme Court decision that it could go forward, it could happen. And the basis for the overturning of the court case in Rhode Island is no longer operative in California. They basically rejected the logic of the Supreme Court in California. So this story goes on. These are just headlines from when I was on the stand every day. The state learned, people in the state learned about the dangers of lead, the dangers of exposure, what was happening to their state. This is, I love this one, paint lawyers work to discredit historian. You know, I mean, when a historian needs to be discredited and it makes headlines every day, it is kind of a humbling moment. But in any case, the history was extremely important in all these cases, and I think in a lot of environmental cases that are coming up right now, and a lot of decisions that are being decided not by scientists and not by experts, but by juries and by people in the community, you can see an increasing demand for historical research, because in some sense it does in many ways help us understand the origins of major crises in a way that laboratory science can't. So I'm going to stop here because lead paint, this is a headline from the California paper. I'm going to stop here and maybe we have some questions. I apologize for going on for this long.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Did silicosis get more media coverage than other diseases like black lung, which perhaps had far more workers over time? Or?
Black lung is black lung and asbestosis. Bisonosis, asbestosis, and black lung were in some sense created out of the silicosis crisis. That's what when I mentioned that I was visiting that old doc who was talking about I wanted to interview him about black lung, and he said, you can't understand the history of black lung without understanding silicosis. What he was referring to is the fact that many of these other diseases emanated out of this crisis. In the 1930s, one of the ways in which silicosis was politically contained, if not epidemiologically contained, was by introducing into workers' comp laws, which essentially eliminated it from lawsuits. You could no longer sue for having silicosis. You had to take minimal coverage through the workers' comp laws. It's a whole different story, but there's a whole kind of governmental and industrial and legal means of trying to essentially eliminate this disease from the public consciousness. So other groups of workers who once were considered at risk of silicosis, asbestos is a silicate, right? And at times it was very closely aligned. They assumed it was silica that was doing the damage. Black lung was called anthracosilicosis at certain points. But the point is that at that point, many of these other diseases were politically divided off of the silicosis issue. So silicosis is non-compensable, but black lung emerges as a diagnosis. Coal workers' pneumoconiosis evolves as a diagnosis, and Lauren Kerr, the person I was talking about, the doctor, pushes very hard for special legislation to make coal workers' pneumoconiosis a special disease that can be compensated. Similarly, bisonosis and similarly asbestosis were in some sense created as clinical entities because of the political implications of being identified as silicosis after 1940. Silicosis was no longer compensable, and so you had to find new definitions. It's a very interesting history of these diseases that were once considered forms of silicosis. So the 500,000 people included coal workers as well as miners in the hard rock areas of the U.S. And by the 1940s, the coal workers had identified themselves not as suffering from anthracosilicosis, but of coal workers' pneumoconiosis. I don't know, the political history of the naming of these diseases and the clinical entities is fascinating. I'm sorry.
Yeah, first a comment, there's an excellent film out now called The Last Mountain, which documents the continuing efforts of industry to blast the tops off of mountains in West Virginia. Right. And the people in the valleys are suffering silicosis. Yes. So I would just ask your opinion. I mean, notwithstanding the lawsuits and the history, it seems to me that industry remains callous and uncaring about the effects of their actions on public health. And where do we stand today on enforcement and remedial action that's effective?
Well, that's
given what's going on, you know?
Well, it's a leading question, but it's also an important question because, I mean, that's why I'm participating in these lawsuits, because I think that there's a really big public discussion going on right now, a public discussion that is seeing disease in a very different light than it once was, and that ultimately these lawsuits are probably very effective means of addressing, much more effective than I should say, special legislation. Public health has backed off a lot of the controversial issues that once drove it, and legislatures, I don't think, are in any mood to pass any kind of special legislation on behalf of workers right now. The lawsuits are changing behavior. I know that probably when I started in silicosis cases, there was a lot more of it than there is now because a lot of companies have ended use of silica as sandblasting material. They just stopped it because of the lawsuits. They could find other materials, they could use other materials. You very rarely go through New York anymore and see the sides of buildings being sandblasted. In the 1950s, 1960s, and 70s, you actually could see that. People sandblasting the sides of our buildings to clean them. Now it's high-powered steam that's often being used. But the point is that these lawsuits are becoming more effective, and partly it's because populations are learning and contending over the causes of disease and having a right to say something about what these diseases represent through these lawsuits. Juries, laymen, are actually learning through these lawsuits about the dangers of asbestos and how prevalent it is in mesothelioma and other diseases. So I'm kind of, in a strange way, kind of sanguine about what's going on. Government, I think, probably has historically not been the agent for change in many industrial situations. I mean, I'm not sure whether it's answering your problem. It's pretty miserable out there. Yeah, right.
I wish I could share in your optimism about the lawsuits. Okay, because I've been on both sides. I mean, suing, we put the lawsuit against EPA about the cleanup of Lower Manhattan after 9/11. Right. We won, and then it got overturned.
Right.
But I think the problem with the lawsuits is that it's almost this belief that the private market and the private law could solve the problem, and we find that it doesn't give immediate relief for the people who need it the most. Yeah. And lawyers take cases where people's damages are, are based, I would say, almost like based on wealth. So how do we counter that, to try to bring back the public health model and to try to get government to stop the exposure right away rather than just trying to get compensation?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that all lawyers are honest upright. You do find some lawyers who are really dedicated to these issues and to workers' rights, and you have to be very careful when you're testifying. And certainly, there's a lot of money involved and a lot of corruption, but given the inability to address it legislatively and the inability of the society to deal with it, I cling to the hope that this is an effective and useful thing, at least for this historian, to participate in, to try to get these guys to basically own up to what they did and what they're doing. I mean, I'm just maybe really naively, and certainly the World Trade Center example is a great example of the futility of it, but I think, I just have to live with some hope. Oh, absolutely. No, it's not the end. It's not the mechanism. It's just what seems to be possible right now. Oh, yeah. No, there are huge cases right now, and I unfortunately know of some of them, and I can't say them here, in which huge decisions have been made that we will never learn about. Huge decisions about environmental pollutants that I'd be thrown in jail if I mentioned, quite honestly. So, yeah, no, that's a problem. Gag orders and taking documents and taking them out of circulation. We're now putting together a website in our center, which is being organized by this wonderful young former graduate student here, Merlin Chakwanyan, and it's going to have upwards of 3 million previously unseen documents from various industries regarding industrial pollution that have just never been mined. It comes out of a course that I've been teaching here called Poisoned Worlds. Well, these documents are documents that I got through discovery as an expert in lawsuits. We're working with the Center for Public Integrity down in Washington that's involved in a huge lawsuit around benzene, and they have a stash of documents through discovery, literally about 100,000, 200,000 documents. We have approximately $500,000 documents. We've just made agreements with a couple of law firms that we've been working with that they're now turning over their entire files on a whole series of industrial hazards that they've never been able to even sort through. Merlin miraculously is discovering means of sorting through quickly, not only through word searches, but concept searches, what are in these documents, which is going to be a fascinating find. I'm sorry.
Thanks. I'm wondering what you think the implications are for the historical profession, particularly given that you opened the talk with that email from the roundtable group.
We're going to have to make some decisions. I mean, I think that it's going to be a very hard time for some of us. We tend to love the ambiguity of data. We love the ambiguity of situations, the relativism in our thinking and our ambiguity about the different positions. We tend to relish that way of thinking. Law firms don't. You have to make a decision, and I found it in some sense very, very liberating. Quite honestly, I don't go into a law case thinking that I'm going to feel satisfied if I have everyone's opinion and give equal weight to everyone's view.
What about the What about the fact that the part of the legal profession anyway doesn't seem to be too worried about expertise? Do you think that this is something that professional bodies need to step in and that it needs to be part of the, because it's not a huge part of the conversation that historians tend to have about our profession.
Right.
Whereas that's quite alarming, actually, that, you know.
Yeah, no, there's going to be incredible incentives. In fact, I'm probably one of a handful of historians. There are probably 3 of us in the country that have decided to work for plaintiffs and to work for labor unions and to work on behalf of cities and public health. The vast majority of historians who stepped into this have been hired by the tobacco industry, the lead industry. At a professional meeting of mine, of my little group of historians, the historians of medicine, there was almost fistfights in the hall because it was discovered that the president of the association had been working for tobacco, developing their historical legal suit of defense for literally 20 years, and that he had been working for these guys, developing a wonderfully sophisticated, on the one hand, on the other hand, we weren't really sure who really knew, argument about what is obviously one of the biggest killers in American history. And so it was a very ugly situation. It actually made the Times. There's an article in the Times about the close to battle that happened at this tiny little professional organization when we discovered that many of our colleagues had been working for tobacco. And their argument was, well, I'm just telling the truth, whatever that is. But there was no moral weight to what they were saying. There was no emphasis on what they didn't see. They actually allowed themselves, you have to make it absolutely clear when you go into these suits that you are entitled to see all the documents. You have a right to all of them. You have a right to publish them if you want, and to write your own thing, because otherwise you're going to be selectively given certain kinds of documents and you will develop it. You know, these guys have developed cases based upon reading the public record alone, as opposed to the internal company documents. Just horrible actions that you would be repulsed by. But it's a real issue that we're going to have to face. I don't know whether I want the AHA to face it, because I think we are all so terrified of becoming part of these things that all will be as a plague on everyone's house, and you can't participate, and you can't, I'm really worried about that.
Could I just follow up about thinking about historians? And I'm very curious how historians are viewed as witnesses by the juries, as opposed to the presumably scientific experts who are brought in for the on the other side.
Yeah. This is something that courts every day are trying to deal with. Is the historian an expert? Are they a scientist? Because there are a lot of legal standards that go into whether or not you can be considered a witness. And there's something called Daubert hearings and Frye hearings and all sorts of legal means of trying to exclude you as a witness. So far, no jury's ever excluded me. No judge has ever excluded me. I think they're getting used to it. I think that I think juries love hearing a historian, if they're being honest, because you speak English, and you don't presume that you have a special expertise that they can't understand. You can show them documents, you can show things that are being said, you can show them physical data that doesn't depend upon an interpretation of what happened in their particular lab or some kind of abstract understanding of one scientific article that doesn't have much meaning to them. But when you can talk to a jury, and when a judge lets you talk to a jury, there's at least in the cases I've chosen to be part of, there's extreme ability to communicate. Talking to a jury often is like talking to wonderful graduate students who are very respectful, but also very thoughtful, and who are willing to think about issues in a slightly different way. So unlike a scientist who often, in some sense, alienates juries, they can be really gruff and condescending. I think historians really do have a way of speaking in a language that's understood, and that doesn't seem like just obfuscation.
So that original letter was right when it said they needed to take their
Well, they had perfected that letter. That letter, it obviously, did you see, I don't know if you noticed it, they said that they had 75,000 scholars around the country. I began from prestigious universities, all on their payroll. Okay, these weren't all historians. Historians were being added to this list of different experts.
Did they know that you were involved in the?
I think that
they must have, right?
Well, I think that they just, I think that they probably didn't. I think they probably just Googled my name, saw it had something to do with lead, or Googled historian lead, and my name popped up, and they contacted me without knowing that they were looking for somebody to testify against me.
Other questions? Yeah, one more.
Thank you. I'd be curious to know if you can speak to how cases like these have been handled in other countries, especially with different legal systems.
Yeah, it's a great question. Kathy, my wife, refuses to go with me to Paris anymore because I'm constantly being asked to go and speak in front of groups in Paris. I don't find it such a terrible thing, but she does. So in any case, the Europeans are fascinated by this whole process. I've spoken in Germany, I've spoken in France, and they're fascinated because it seems like they're, again, I don't know enough about the Napoleonic legal system, but they don't have liability suits. And if you're going to have change, I once was bemoaning the fact that we had no strong central state that was willing to have national standards to protect workers like they did in Paris, in France, where there's a strong central state. And they all looked at me with total, amazement, and they said to me, "You don't understand why we're so impressed by this whole discussion you're going through." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "In Paris, if you're going to have any kind of change, there's no way that an individual worker who believes he's been insulted and hurt can ever have a voice in the legal system. That it all has to come through organized bodies or ministers, and that there is no system by which anybody can bring a suit." And they saw this suit as kind of a way of acknowledging and responding to demands of working people for a voice. And they said, "We have no mechanism of doing that here. We have to wait for our union, we have to wait for our minister to decide there's a problem. And we don't have the ability, just if you're really pissed off, basically, if you're really pissed off, we don't have the ability to actually have representation in a courtroom where people can hear our position." It was a very moving kind of moment because they understood, they were seeing the court basically as a public square, as a way of having a public discussion of an issue that professionals had reserved, and that these court cases were the ability of a worker to force the society to face an issue that it didn't want to face.
But it's really class action. I mean, it's not class action.
No, there's a tremendous resistance. Class action suits, they sound great. They end up with very, very little compensation for the individual worker. Yeah.